Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel, Neri the Coder. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about thinking in JSX, or in simple word, I would say Introduction to JSX. We will see what is JSX and why do we use JSX. So as we have seen in our application that we converted the functional component from a function to a class-based component, and then we dealt with the state management over here, and also we tried to modify the state based on a click event. But now you can see over here that we are using some syntax that's basically similar to HTML, but that is inside a function, and that's basically a JavaScript, and it's not actually HTML. What it is if it is not HTML? This is basically called JSX, and it is a syntax extension to JavaScript. Why do we use JSX instead of HTML? React embraces the fact that rendering logic is inherently coupled with other UI logic, how events are handled, how state changes over time, and how the data is prepared to display. Instead of artificially separating technologies by putting the markup in separate folders like index.html and something like that, and separate the logic and putting them in a separate files like some script.js or something like that. So React separate concerns with loosely coupled units called components that contain both the logic and the markup. React doesn't actually require using JSX, but most people find it helpful as a visual aid when working with UI inside the JavaScript code. It also allows React to show more useful errors, warning messages, and all that. Another reason that we are using JSX inside React is basically embedding expressions in JSX. So through this syntax, or through JSX, we can easily embed the JavaScript expressions in JSX so that you can see that we are accessing the state that's basically JavaScript over here. And just by putting the curly braces over here, we are able to access this variable over here, and we can input this. And also you can see that how we are handling the events on the JSX, that's basically different from the normal HTML function. With HTML, you will simply do onClick without the camel case, and you will pass it a string over here and then the function name, but you cannot, have a full function over here like this. So this is why the JSX comes more handier, because it gives you full flexibility of embedding expressions in your JSX components. JSX is an expression too. After compilation, JSX expressions become regular JavaScript functions, calls, and evaluate JavaScript objects. This means that you can use JSX inside of if statements and for loops, and assign it to variables, and you can also accept it as an argument and return it from a function. So let's say we have another functional component over here, and we call it get greeting or whatever you want to call it. So we can simply do, if some condition is true, then return some JSX. Let's say this, and we can say hello user. Otherwise, we can return something else. We can also return something else. So this is how basically you can deal with JSX, and it's really easier. Another key difference is basically the specifying attributes with JSX. You may use quotes to specify string literal as attributes in normal HTML, but in here we can simply make use of, for example, if I want to specify the class name in JSX, I simply have to wrap it in with this. It's not necessary. You can also use the double quotes, but for sometimes you want to add dynamic values, or you want to assign the class name to a variable. Let's say a variable and then class name, and then you want to assign it to this variable. I'll have to change this a little bit. Let's say app class, and I can just assign it to it like this. Please make sure that you don't put quotes around curly braces when embedding a JavaScript expression in an attribute. So a class name is basically an attribute. OnClick is an attribute as well. There are a lot of other attributes that we will see in the upcoming lectures as well. You don't have to put any quotes around this, for example the app class, because that's an expression. In this case, it's a variable that we are assigning it to the class name attribute. So make sure that you don't do that when you're using the curly braces. You should either use quotes for string values. If it's just a string value like this, you can just put it as it is like this. But if it's a expression and you want to make it dynamic, or for some other reason you're using an expression, then you just have to wrap them in the curly braces. Since JSX is closer to JavaScript than to HTML, React DOM uses camel case naming convention instead of HTML attributes name. So you can see that React is basically using the camel case naming convention instead of just the class. So on HTML we use class, and on click instead of the camel case we use something like this. But that's basically different than React, and we use camel case naming convention over here. JSX also prevents injection attacks, and it is safe to embed user input in JSX. Because by default React DOM escapes any value embedded in JSX before rendering them. Thus it ensures that you can never inject anything that's not explicitly written in your application. Everything is converted to a string before being rendered. This helps prevent cross-site scripting attacks as well. So you don't have to worry about the cross-site scripting or the injection attacks in JSX. JSX represents objects. So Babel basically compiles JSX down to react.createElement calls. So let's say we have an element over here, and we return simply an h1 tag, and we say hello world. So this expression is basically converted to this. I'll name it something else just to make it clearer. And React by default does something like this: react.createElement. We can also make use of this interchangeably if you want. So here you have to specify the tag name. You have the list of the tags over here. So in our case, we'll just use the h1, and then you can pass a list of attributes that you want. So for example, in our case, we can pass a class name greeting or whatever, and then we can pass the value, whatever expression or value that we want to pass to that element. So in our case, we'll just do hello world. So these two elements are basically identical. So you can either make use of react.createElement, and you can either make use of this. So if I print them both over here, for now I'll just get rid of this. I'll just print the element, and I'll also print the element function over here. When I save this, you can see hello world and hello world. Testing purpose, I'll just get rid of this. Hello world from element from function. When I save it, you can see hello world from element and hello world from function. In this case, in the react.createElement case, react.createElement performs few checks to help you write bug-free code, but essentially it creates an object that looks like this. So basically it's converted to this object. These objects are called React elements. You can think of them as descriptions of what you want to see on the screen. React reads these objects and uses them to construct the DOM and keep it up to date. We will explore more about JSX, and we'll talk about it in the upcoming lectures as well. And there is another debate about when to use the class components and when to use functional component. And most of the time people are using the functional components because of the hooks and all that. Whenever we come to hooks, using the hooks, we'll make use of the functional component as well. But for now, that's all about JSX, and I'll see you in the next lecture.